Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Acuity Risk Management and the Institute of Risk Management, the rising importance of holistic third-party risk management. I'm going to soon pass you over to my colleagues at Acuity Risk, but a couple of housekeeping things just so that you know what the order is today and some of the features of GoToWebinar. So the webinar is scheduled to run for an hour. We have left a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So you will have the option to ask questions during the webinar. On the right-hand side, you'll be able to type those questions in. We'll be monitoring those questions, and we will hopefully go through them at the end of the webinar. Anything that we can't answer for any reason, we'll follow up after the webinar. Now, some people may have any issues with connectivity, audio, video. The webinar is being recorded, so if for any reason you have any problems, you'll have access to the recording about a couple of hours after the webinar is completed. Now, we are going to be running a couple of polls during the session. We'd encourage you to participate in those because it gives us a good understanding of what the kind of mood out there is in the room, and you will also be getting a survey at the end of the webinar, and we really appreciate if you could complete that survey as well. So that kind of leads me to hand over to Acuity Risk Management. So we've got Simon Marvel, who's going to be presenting, and Doris Cosma, who's going to be supporting him today. So Simon, if I hand over to you.
Sanjay, thank you very much, and hello everybody. Very warm welcome to the webinar today, the rising importance of holistic third-party risk management. As Sanjay said, I'm Simon Marvel. I'm the founder, CEO of Acuity. Before we started Acuity in 2005, I spent 20 years in consultancy, 13 years of that with a firm called Insight Consulting. We specialized in information security, business continuity, and enterprise risk management consultancy services. And then from 2005, I've been with Acuity, and we've created a software platform called Stream for governance, risk and compliance and integrated risk management and related services. And we specialize primarily in cyber, enterprise, third-party risk management and related applications. My colleague Doris Cosma is our marketing manager here at Acuity. And Doris will kindly moderate the questions for us at the end of the session. So just to reiterate what Sanjay said, please do feel free to add your questions into the portal as we go. So after this brief introduction, just talk a little bit about the proliferation of third parties and how that's extended the enterprise over recent years. Talk a bit then about what do we think good third-party risk management looks like, and in particular, the growing importance we feel for an holistic approach to third-party risk management. Any approach that we take has to be practical, has to be usable, so I want to focus down on some practicalities, and then I'll draw things to a close with what I see as a summary of benefits, some recommendations, and as we've said already, some time for Q&A. So the world is complex, it's chaotic. We're seeing unprecedented levels of change happening very quickly. The world's being transformed by new technology. Digital transformation, which was underway before the pandemic, has accelerated during the pandemic. And organizations are no longer easily defined by compact and clear boundaries. Instead, we have an extended web of vendors, suppliers, partners, agents, brokers, consultants, contractors, subcontractors, and so on. And there's now an extensive global value chain, and we've seen the implications of this when things go wrong. The current transport crisis in the UK at the moment, the pandemic related disruptions, blocking of the Suez Canal, which had quite severe implications for the global supply chain. I noticed a survey by McKinsey, the global management consultancy, which was published in 2020. I thought this was quite an interesting graphic, and it's showing a grid here, and on the vertical axis, we're looking at the magnitude of estimated cost of shocks to the global value chain, and this ranges from millions of dollars at the bottom up to tens of trillions of dollars at the top. And across the horizontal axis, we've got the sort of the lead time, the ability to anticipate these sorts of shocks, which range from nothing or a few days to weeks or months as we go across from left to right. And so starting down in the bottom left part of the grid, these are unanticipated business disruptions. They could still cause quite significant cost, millions up to tens and hundreds of billions, and they include things like counterfeiting, man-made disasters. Common cyber attacks are in there, so I put in that category events like SolarWinds, Kaseya, where large numbers of organizations were impacted by malware that had been inserted into software or networking equipment and then passed out to those third parties' customers. Incidentally, the color of the dots here is an indication of the frequency of these events. So the black dots are more frequent, and then the less frequent are sort of dark blue, light blue, and those that are gray haven't yet happened. But if we go across the bottom right, we can see these are foreseeable disruptions. So again, quite significant impacts, but a bit more time to foresee them coming. So we've got acute climatological events such as heat waves, flooding that we saw through the summer in the western side of North America and in Europe. Coming up to top left, and this is where we start to get quite apocalyptic: meteoroid strikes, solar storms, extreme terrorism such as a dirty bomb, and so on. And also there is systemic cyber attack. So this could be a breakdown, disruption of the financial system, the global financial system, power grids, and so on. Unfortunately, none of these events have happened yet, but the interesting point is that they could happen with very little notice or ability to anticipate them. And then finally, at top right, we have foreseeable catastrophes such as financial crisis, global military conflict, and so on. On the right-hand side, I also found this really interesting. That's the expected disruption, so the expected frequency of disruption. And the survey here sort of indicated that disruptions of 1 to 2 weeks might happen every 2 years, 2 to 4 weeks every 2.8 years, 1 to 2 months every 3.7, and disruptions causing an impact of more than 2 months could happen almost once every 5 years. So quite sort of daunting figures, I think. There's also increasing interconnectedness in risk. This was a survey from Gartner in 2020. It looked at or asked attendees at a webinar which third-party compliance risk has increased or could increase the most at your organization as a result of the pandemic. And probably unsurprisingly, 52% said cybersecurity and data breach, and organizations were concerned about their third parties suddenly having to work from home and therefore being vulnerable to network-related security attacks. And you can see the other areas of concern there as well. I'll say no great surprise, but I wonder how many of us before late 2019 had even modeled pandemic and the effect of a pandemic on the supply chain, and how many of us had then gone on to model the consequential risk of cybersecurity and data breaches. Not very many, I would suggest. But we need to start thinking in this way, or at least understand our supply chain and its dependencies, and to plan for resilience. One further set of stats I thought was quite interesting. This was from Deloitte, from 2021, Third-Party Risk Management Survey. Deloitte found that 51% of the organizations that they surveyed had faced one or more third-party risk incidents during the COVID-19 response. and 13% of those were high impact incidents, so resulting in severe compromise of financial performance, profitability, customer service, and in some cases, a breach of regulations. 20% of the organizations that hadn't invested adequately in third-party risk management before the pandemic had a high impact incident, compared to only 2% of those that had invested before the pandemic. And then finally, 71% now identify digital risk as a top priority for them across the supply chain. And this is despite 42% being concerned about inadequate levels of cybersecurity investment. Now, clearly, the types of risk that we're seeing across the global supply chain are many and varied. I'm going to concentrate primarily in this session on digital risk and use digital risk examples, mainly because I think it's probably the most complex risk to manage from a third-party perspective. It's difficult to visualize, it's difficult to get your arms around the problem. So I thought I would use that as an example through this webinar. But what I'll be talking about applies equally well to other categories of risk, and I hope you better see that as we go through. So one of the things I'd like to talk about with digital risk is just some of the characteristics of digital risk. And one factor I think that's sometimes overlooked is that digital risk is continuous. We're used to assessing risks occasionally, or assessing risks to projects or programs where we assess the risk, we manage it, we monitor it, and then we close that risk and it's gone. Digital risk is an ongoing operational risk, and it's with us all the time. It just changes as we go. So to try and illustrate that, if we take any sort of organization, they have business goals, they're seeking to achieve business outcomes, they use critical business processes to try and deliver those. And those processes depend upon critical and sensitive information assets, and also other supporting assets such as networks, applications, teams of people, third parties, and so on. Now, things can happen over time that have the effect of increasing our risk. So new threats can emerge, threats can increase, so the risk from a threat can become higher. Vulnerabilities can emerge, which can be exploited. Incidents can occur, which, although not necessarily increasing the level of risk, are shining a light on the fact that perhaps we're at a higher level of risk than we thought we were. Controls can fail or be weaker than we thought they were. And all of these can have the effect of increasing the risk that the business is facing. Of course, we can also take action to try to reduce those risks, so we can mitigate vulnerabilities, we can address weak or failing controls, we can implement new controls to try and mitigate new threats, and perhaps the threat might reduce of its own accord over time. And that means that over time, our risk goes up and it goes down. And at any particular point, we might be operating beneath our tolerance for risk, or we might be operating above our tolerance. And what I mean by that is that if we're having incidents of a severity or a frequency or combination of the two that is just intolerable to the business, then we're operating above our tolerance for risk. And it's interesting that if we operate above our tolerance for risk for any length of time, then we're going to get more severe incidents or more incidents than we are prepared to tolerate. And the result of that is likely to be that our costs are going to go up above what we budgeted for. We're going to have to respond to incidents. There might be legal, regulatory, reporting costs. There might be mitigation, rectification costs. There might be reputational damage and so on as we go. So our costs are likely to rise above budget. And similarly, our performance against target, our business outcomes, and our achievement of those is likely to dip beneath target as well, because potentially reputational damage, increased costs, increased customer churn, additional costs of acquiring new customers, and so on. So I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that operating above our tolerance for risk for any period of time is a good leading indicator of potential future increased costs and poor performance. And there's a good example of this was from Equifax, who had a serious data breach in 2017, and then in their 2019 accounts, they reported a $690 million legal and investigatory charge, an $83 million charge for security transformation, and a $556 million hit on profits. Okay, so it's quite complex. We're looking at a complex web of dependencies. Achieving our business outcomes relies upon these critical and sensitive information assets and our other assets such as people, process, technology, third parties, and so on. And all of those, in turn, are potentially subject to risk. So our people can be coerced or can be bribed. They might be disgruntled and mount some sort of attack on the organization. We might suffer process errors or failures. If we have where we're using technology, then we're subject to misuse and abuse, potentially, and failures of the technology. And as far as suppliers are concerned, third parties, then it's all of the above, because third parties themselves rely upon people, process, technology, and other third parties. So it really is quite a complex web of dependencies that we're having to deal with. So I think hopefully you get the picture that overall it's very complicated. We struggle to protect our own organization against cyber risks and other risks. When we have hundreds or thousands, or in some cases tens of thousands of third parties in the extended enterprise, then how on earth do we get our arms around the problem? So I think the first thing I'd like to do then is just to look at what does good third-party risk management look like. And so this is Acuity's suggestion on what it looks like. I'd be interested in any feedback in the chat on this, and there will be a couple of polls that I'll put up in a minute, just asking for a couple of thoughts about this. But in my opinion, good third-party risk management outcome, the most important one probably, is that risks posed by third parties are kept tolerable and they're proportional to the value that the third party is adding. So if we can tolerate incidents, we have some resilience to those incidents occurring. We can't avoid them altogether, but we want to make sure when they happen that they're proportional. And this really implies that we need to be able to measure and understand our risk and compare it against our tolerance for risk. Secondly, resources are targeted at third parties posing the highest risks, and our effort is in proportion to the level of risk. Changes to risk as a result of business actions should be captured. So if we're increasing the volumes of business that we're putting with a third party, if we're putting new services or asking a third party to provide new services, then we want to make sure that we capture those changes and the risks relating to those changes. We think it's important that organizations and their vendors collaborate to manage risk in a sort of common goal of making sure that we're achieving the level of protection and in this case, security that we're seeking to achieve. That our priorities and decisions are risk informed. So if we're taking on a vendor, we understand the risks that are associated with that. And then finally, we think it's important that we continually optimize and improve, because some of these third-party programs are huge undertakings, and we need to make sure that they're effective, and we need to make sure that they continue to improve over time. I think if you agree with these outcomes, the ability to measure our risk and to understand our risk and to compare our risk against tolerance is really important. I think it was Peter Drucker, who was a very well-known management consultant, who said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So the measurement of risk from third parties, we think, is really important. So at this point, I'd just like to put up a couple of audience polls just to get your feedback on a couple of things that we've covered so far. So if I bear with me, and I'll just open the first poll. And this one, I'd quite like you, if you wouldn't mind, to give your response to this statement. We have good visibility of the level of risk in our business from third parties. So again, this is confidential. None of this data is going to be shared anywhere else, but I'd be very interested to know how you feel about visibility of risk within your organizations in relation to third parties. If you're a consultant, perhaps maybe answer on behalf of one or two of your customers if you can. So I'll just give it a few seconds for people to respond. Okay, I've got 70% of us have voted, so just a couple more seconds for anybody else that wants to jump in. Okay, let me close that now and then share the results with you. So thanks very much for participating. 52% of you said, yes, you have good visibility of the level of risk. 35% said no, and 13% don't know. So I actually think that's quite a good response for yes. I think it's a really tricky problem to try and understand the level of risk from third parties. So 52% I think is a good response there. So I'll put the second poll up. If I can just find that. Okay. So hopefully you can see that now. And this question is, we're confident that the risks posed by third parties are kept tolerable and proportional to the value that's added by the third party. And again, I'll leave 30 seconds or so for that question to be answered. Okay, so we've almost 70% have voted. Okay, so I'll close, just about to close that one now. I'll share the results of that. So hopefully you can see this. So 52% yes, 29% no, 19% don't know. So more don't knows than last time. Still a pretty good score on yes. So I think that's very impressive for those organizations that have confidence that these risks are under control. Great. Well, thanks very much for that. Won't dwell on those any longer, but that's been really insightful feedback. So let me close that, and hopefully we're back on screen. So moving on then to how we go about achieving those good outcomes. I think we need to think a bit more widely about third-party risk management. a holistic approach to third-party risk management. And just thinking about where we start with that, this was another survey. This was from the Ponemon Institute, looking at third-party risk management. The question here was, how does your organization determine which third parties should receive due diligence assessments? Top answer there was third party has access to our most confidential information, such as trade secrets, intellectual property. Number two, third party has the potential to affect our organization's ability to comply with regulations. And number three, third party is critical to our organization's ability to meet its business objectives and obligations. So all quite understandable sort of categorizations and priorities. Second one I just wanted to put up was what types of third parties does your organization prioritize and focus its due diligence on? So you can see here, unsurprisingly, cloud providers at the top, payroll providers, law firms, and you can see the rest of the list as we go down to outsourced HR and payment processors. Now, both of these questions asked about due diligence and prioritizing the organizations that we're going to do due diligence on. And typical third-party due diligence, in my experience, as a provider of technology and software services, so in the digital risk area, then the prime approach to assessing this type of due diligence is through a questionnaire, which tends to be focused on control standards such as the NIST cybersecurity framework or perhaps the ISO 27001 framework. And this is a spider chart, example spider chart from ISO 27001. So these are the various categories in ISO 27001. There are 130 controls in the code of practice, the Annex A from ISO 27001. And I can't tell you how many questionnaires I've received, or we've received, I should say, asking about 130 questions on our controls in each of these areas. Now, I think it's worth just really making sure that we understand that asking questions about controls only is asking questions about part of the information that contributes to our understanding of risk. It's about controls, and it tends to be, I find there tend to be quite general questions about controls rather than specific questions about controls in relation to specific risks. I'm sure many of you have heard of security ratings solutions. So these are platforms. These have become fairly widely used over the last couple of years. And these are platforms that scan what's visible via the web from across third parties. They work very quickly. You can get a very quick picture or some sort of view, if you like, or assessment of a third party and a security rating of that third party from these security ratings tools. Now, they tend to be looking at vulnerabilities. They're looking at what external hackers can see when they're scanning the organization. So it tends to be looking at vulnerabilities. So they're addressing the vulnerability part of the picture, but only the vulnerabilities that relate to an external attack. Okay, so they're not really helping with the insider threat from our own people or from people within the third party. They're not helping in relation to process-related failures and so on. So again, they're important as are questionnaires that are focused on controls, but they're only providing part of the picture. And one thing that's often missing, in my opinion, is an assessment of the threat. What are we really concerned about? And if we don't understand the specific threat, the risk that we're concerned about, then we don't really understand the risk. It tells us nothing about the risk, really, and it doesn't tell us whether the risk is tolerable or not. So the fact that we have good controls generally that are aligned with something like ISO 27001, although it's comforting, doesn't tell me very much about the risk that I'm facing. I think one of the other issues is that vendors, third parties, have to spend a lot of time responding to third-party questionnaires, and dare I suggest they might occasionally mislead or even lie on their responses. So I think, again, relying too heavily on questionnaire responses that aren't or can't be validated in some way is another potential weakness in third-party programs. Final point, I guess, is that with digital risk being continuous and questionnaires being asked often at the onboarding stage with a third party, occasionally reviewed on a timetable, but probably not more than once every year or once every couple of years, then again, I'm not sure that we can be always that comfortable that we have an up-to-date understanding of the situation with our third parties. So how can we deal with this? And the answer, I think, is to take a risk-based approach to third-party risk management. So McKinsey identified in a report about 12 months ago, I think it was, maybe 18 months ago, that most organizations these days take a maturity-based approach to cybersecurity. So it's all about building capability. It's about implementing controls, quite often guided by best practice, such as NIST cybersecurity framework, ISO 27001, and so on. So we look at implementing controls like identity and access management, application monitoring. The problem is that we end up applying controls, we apply everything to everything. So we tend to get unmanageable growth, our spending can escalate, we can get implementation gridlock, dashboards are permanently stuck on amber, and it doesn't really reduce risk. So McKinsey are saying that we should move to a risk-based approach to cybersecurity, and this is focused on reducing enterprise risk. So it's about identifying the priority and prioritizing the controls that will reduce risk. It's about aligning our approach with the enterprise risk management framework and the business's tolerance for risk. It's about focusing our effort on the high risk areas, and it's about taking a pragmatic approach to reducing risk down to within the business's tolerance. So if I was to summarize in terms of requirements for an effective third-party risk management program, I would suggest take a risk-based approach, focus on the key controls that are going to reduce risk and monitor those controls very carefully. Monitor contextual information that will help us to understand the risk. So information from security ratings tools, very valuable. Information on incidents that are occurring, near misses, news potentially relating to the third party. We'll come on to talk a little bit more about this a little bit later on. This is not to say that we should ignore the third party's security management processes. But I'm of the opinion that we only get assurance of a third party's security management processes from a certified information security management system. So I would suggest that where you have third parties handling the most sensitive and the most critical data, then you should look at requiring an ISO 27001 certificate, which is externally audited from those critical third parties. And there's a bit of a misconception, I think, generally, that implementing the ISO 27001 code of practice makes you secure. It doesn't. But ISO 27001 itself is much more than a list of controls. The full standard is a management system with processes for risk assessment, risk identification, risk assessment, risk management, incident management, ongoing monitoring and review, and both internal audit and external audit of your policies and your approach and your risk assessment and so on. So if an organization has gone through that process and has a certificate against ISO 27001, then you can have confidence in that organization's security management processes. It's important to check the scope because quite often the scope of the certificate can be limited. So you need to make sure that the scope is addressing the products and the services that you're using from that third party. And I've just put up the scope of our ISMS certificate here, which is design, development, hosting, sales of our IRM solution stream and the supporting consultancy, training and application support services to clients worldwide. So that's a pretty broad scope of certificate. You still need to make sure that your third party is addressing the risks that are of concern to you. And I would suggest that you should also monitor, perhaps more frequently than you would do otherwise, the performance of those key controls that are mitigating those risks. So let's have a look now at how we can bring this to life and how we can take a practical approach, a risk-based approach to third-party risk management. So the first thing I think is we need to identify the specific risks of concern with our vendors, having categorized them, probably having triaged them and so on. What are we really concerned about from particular vendors? Is it loss of sensitive health data, for example, personal health data? Is it fraudulent payments? Is it inability to access credit data or watch lists? Is it failure to achieve contracted service levels, for example, delivery of goods due to lack of drivers and fuel that we're seeing in the UK at the moment? And if we can identify those in relation to our critical vendors, then what are the key controls that are addressing these risks? Encryption of sensitive health records, processes for intercepting fraudulent payments, making sure that we're resilient to the disruption or failure of third parties, avoiding single points of failure, that sort of thing. So it's identifying the key controls that are addressing those risks as well as the risks themselves. And then I would strongly recommend that we assess the risk and that we quantify the risk. And we talked about the quantification of risk in an earlier webinar that we ran at the end of August, and I'll provide details of that towards the end. And we went into this in a little bit more detail than I have time to go into it today. But essentially it is recognizing that there's uncertainty in risk. So that if we suffer a failure, if we suffer a loss event of some sort of risk materializes, then the cost of that, the severity of the loss, isn't a single point. There's uncertainty. There's a most likely loss in most cases with a certain probability, but the loss could be less and it could be higher. And quite a lot of research has been done on this, and this is an example of a log normal distribution. And the research has shown that most operational loss events, in terms of their severity, follow this type of distribution. Okay. Second thing that we need to know to quantify risk is how frequently are these incidents going to happen? And again, the same sort of research on operational loss events has found that this type of distribution tends to occur for operational loss events. This is called a Poisson distribution, and there's a most likely frequency, but it could be less and it could be higher. And the Poisson distribution is also a very useful distribution for modeling frequencies which are less than 1. So once every 5 years, 10 years, 20 years can also be modeled using a Poisson distribution. Now, if we can understand these distributions, then we can combine them together using Monte Carlo analysis, and that allows us to create this sort of loss exceedance profile, which is a risk profile measurement. And it's telling us the probability that we're going to lose more than certain dollar values in the next 12 months. Okay. Now, the really interesting thing is that you don't need a lot of data in order to be able to assess these risks and to generate this type of loss distribution. In fact, there are 4 data points that you need. 3 of them relate to severity. So the lower bound, the upper bound, and the confidence interval of the potential loss. So if we're concerned about the risk of fraudulent transactions, for example, in relation to a cloud service provided by a third party, then what do we think is the upper bound and the confidence interval? So we might say we think the loss could be between $5 and $20 million in 90% of the cases. And if we can specify that sort of information, that's enough information to understand the shape of this distribution. Similarly, for the frequency profile, if we know the most likely frequency, is it 10 times a year? Is it once every 2 years? Is it once every 5 years? And so on. That's all we need to know to understand the Poisson distribution. And so these 4 data points, 3 that relate to severity, and which are really us as the organization, which is dependent upon third party. This is information that we will understand. We'll need to derive this information, make some decisions on this sort of information, but it's within our boundary, within our control. The frequency of the event depends a lot more on the third party and the risks associated with the third party and the controls that the third party is deploying, the vulnerabilities that they have, and so on. Okay. So just to provide a quick example of that, so this is an example from our Stream platform, an example report, and this is a loss exceedance curve, and this is showing us 3 example data points here. So we're showing that currently there's an 85% we could lose more than $1 million in the next 12 months. There's a 30% chance we could lose more than 4 million, and there's a 10% chance we could lose more than 5 million. Okay, if we understand our tolerance for risk, we can see here that management's only prepared to tolerate 25% chance of losing more than 1 million, an 8% chance, and a 5% chance of losing more than 5 million. So there's a gap here. There's a gap between our current level of risk and management's tolerance for risk. So this is an area where we've concerned and we need to do something. By taking a quantitative approach and using Monte Carlo analysis, you're able to aggregate risk. So we can aggregate all of the risks related to a third party. And again, I would suggest that we're only considering a small number of key risks in each case, but we can aggregate and produce a loss exceedance curve for each third party. So you can see third party 1, 2, 3, and 4 here, each with their own loss distributions. And then we can see an aggregate third party risk across all of those third parties. And we can compare that against our aggregate tolerance for risk across our third parties, because we might be hit by multiple events affecting different third parties. So there's an aggregate risk as well as an individual risk, and we can aggregate these risks and group these risks in whichever way is suitable. So whether it's by category of third party, for example, whether it's by third parties within a particular region. Again, it's a very flexible way of aggregating the risk and comparing against management's tolerance for risk. So in terms of addressing risks and where we have risk that's above our tolerance, then really the levers that we have for addressing those risks and reducing those risks are the deployment of controls. We need to make sure that those key controls are operating effectively, and if we still have an intolerable risk, then we need to look at additional controls, either deployed by the third party or deployed by us ourselves to somehow try to mitigate that risk. So again, we need to understand, and if where we got really critical third parties processing really critical and sensitive data, then we should monitor those controls quite frequently, I would say. Whether we do it monthly or quarterly or 6 monthly, it will depend. But if you're monitoring a small number of key controls that are really addressing risk, then I would suggest that's more valuable than more broadly based controls-based questionnaires, if you see what I'm saying. So I think we can integrate controls assurance with risk management. If you have the right platform, then you can capture the status of controls and automatically and immediately update the risk profile and see how that compares with tolerance for risk. We talked about contextual information previously. The key levers, as we've been seeing, are the controls that are deployed to address the specific risks of concern, but there's a lot of other information that gives us good contextual information that helps us to understand our risks. So security ratings, as I mentioned previously, they provide part of the picture. That information can be collected very quickly in an automated fashion and linked in. The performance of the third party against KPIs, against service level agreements, and so on, that can shine a light. Clearly, we want visibility of incidents that are affecting us or are adjacent to us, and possibly near misses as well. A whole range of potential other events or issues might also enlighten us about risk. So if we're seeing the third party is receiving fines for regulatory breaches, they're getting negative press coverage, they're getting sanctions applied to them, and so on. Again, this is all information that helps to build a picture of our risk status. The results from audits and tests, again, will inform us. And similarly, if we're collaborating with our third parties and we've agreed actions that a third party is going to take to address specific risks that we're concerned about, for example, perhaps strengthening controls or implementing new controls, then we want to track those actions because until those actions are complete, we haven't reduced the risk and we're still sitting at perhaps an intolerable level of risk. So just moving on quickly then to the practicality of this sort of thing, and third-party risk management these days can't be handled by spreadsheets. You need a platform to be able to do this. This is just an example of a slide that we sometimes put up to illustrate our stream platform, and I've just sort of edited this slightly for third-party risk management bases. So the typical interactions, if you like, with third-party risk management are from business users, the external third parties themselves, usually risk management specialists in there, senior stakeholders who want to see some dashboarding and reporting and so on. Now, typically business users and external third parties would interact via customized web forms. So for the questionnaire that goes out to the external third party, which perhaps might be more focused on key controls to address specific risks rather than necessarily a very broad, widely focused questionnaire. But again, it's up obviously to individual organizations what they include within the questionnaire. Web forms for business users, so for onboarding business users, for the initial categorization, perhaps initial triage, and so on. Again, web forms are a very good way of that sort of interaction. And then within the, there's another interface here, which is to other systems. So bringing in automatically data from security ratings tools. We have an integration at Acuity with a UK security ratings vendor called Darkbeam, and we're in the process of building another integration at the moment with a leading US provider of security ratings solutions, but other systems as well that are going to provide the contextual data into our understanding of risk. And then within the Stream platform itself, then we have the mapping of the risks and the controls, the quant risk assessment, so the Monte Carlo analysis, the automation, the workflow, the firing off of web forms, the automatic capture of data and updating of the risk status, and so on, and of course the dashboards and the reporting. So just sort of drawing things to a close and moving on to just looking at benefits. The first benefit, I think, is that this type of approach, a risk-based approach to third-party risk management, helps you to deliver those good third-party risk management outcomes. So I won't go through all of these. We put these up earlier, but it's going to help you to focus and keep the risks tolerable and proportional. So to summarize the benefits, it helps you to deliver good third-party risk management outcomes. It should align with the board's tolerance for risk, because we need to have those conversations about what's a tolerable level of risk. It delivers improved third-party risk management at reduced costs. And I would suggest that you seriously think about and consider the value that you're getting from broad-based controls questionnaires that are undertaken as part of due diligence. And perhaps think about reducing the workload that's associated with doing that, and focusing down perhaps on a smaller number of key controls and key metrics that are going to inform you about your overall risk status. And also think about the other contextual data that you could capture to inform your understanding of risk. I think with a quantitative approach, then we can continually optimize as we collect more data. So as we see incidents occurring, near misses, we can track those, we can look back. How did our assessment compare with what's happened in practice? And then finally, I think final benefit is that it's going to enable better board conversations, because we're going to be able to talk in financial language that the board understands. We're going to be able to illustrate risk related to tolerance, where our high risks are, what actions that we're taking to address those risks. So finally, my recommendations are: take a risk-based, practical, risk-based approach to third-party risk management. Focus on the top risks and the key controls. Quantify and aggregate risk where you can and compare it with tolerance. I suggest require a certified ISMS for those third parties that are handling the most sensitive and critical data. Keep informed by monitoring relevant contextual information. And I think if we do all of that, we should be able to work smarter and not harder, get better risk information out of our third-party risk management programs, and also I think work more collaboratively with vendors by addressing specific issues and concerns, rather than burdening them with quite in some cases bureaucratic, can't say it, controls-based questionnaires, and then continually review and improve. Okay, just very quickly, there are some resources available on the website. There are some on the portal as well, about the range of applications that we can support you with using our Stream platform. We've been talking mainly about third-party vendor risk management, cyber risk and IT, but you can see the others as well. Masses of information on the website about each of those, including all of our previous webinars. Some resources that are available for you to download in the portal today, or you can contact us via the website. I mentioned the previous webinar, which we ran on the 26th of August, also with the Institute of Risk Management. This was doing more with less. the benefits of quantitative risk assessment. That's available on demand on both the IRM and the Acuity website. And as Sanjay said at the start, this will be recorded and will also be available in the coming days on both websites as well. If you would like to see a demonstration of our platform for third-party risk management or any of those other applications, then please do contact us. And of course, please do also look at the other content and resources on our website. And I think with that, I'll stop presenting and perhaps ask Doris if you'd like to moderate any questions that have come in, please.
Of course. So we've had a couple of questions here. I'm sure that a few more might come through once people have digested the content a little bit. Certainly very interesting points there, Simon. So thank you very much for that. The first question that I see here is how can you use security rating scores in a risk assessment?
Okay, so I think as I mentioned, security ratings tools such as Dartbeam allow you to scan very quickly multiple third parties. So many third parties very quickly can capture information from what's visible via the web, and they tend to use a sort of proprietary scoring system to assess the third party. It allows you to rank the third party, compare against each other, and so on. As I said, or tried to indicate in the presentation, I think they're an indication generally of sort of vulnerabilities and perhaps the organization's management of vulnerabilities. If you see a vulnerability that's there and it's not been remediated a month later or 3 months later, for example, it's telling you something about the vulnerability management process. So it's giving you some information. It's about understanding what the score is telling you, and then within Stream we would import that data via our API. We can link that to the risk assessment, and we can use that scoring to update the risk assessment in real time. So it's an indication, if you like, and if we want that automated update, then for an organization that scores poorly on a security ratings tool, then we can update the risk assessment, which will flow through in terms of the dashboarding and the reporting of risk.
Thank you for that, Simon. One question here is asking if you've got any tips on handling fourth parties in the supply chain.
So this is the third parties, if you like. So the third parties, subcontractors. I think the more subcontractors that the third party has, the higher the potential frequency of loss event, of risk. So I think you can model that. You can sort of take account of that. You can adjust the frequency potentially based on the number of subcontractors. We can model that dependency on our platform down through the supply chain. Sometimes that allows you, or it provides visibility that multiple third parties might be dependent upon the same fourth party, as it were. So then you might scrutinize that particular fourth party a bit more carefully. Again, if we've got really sensitive and critical data that's going down a sort of supply chain, if you like, to multiple subcontractors, then looking at certification against standards like ISO 27001 further down the supply chain, I think, is important as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And I was also thinking, while kind of wrapping up the series, to mention that third-party risk management, like Simon has pointed out, is obviously a very complex issue, right? And there's quite a lot to think about. And actually, in our last webinar of the series, where we talked about quantitative risk assessments, we touched upon how that can help make better financial decisions, and quantifying that risk that comes from third parties, I think, is really big takeaway in this webinar, right, Simon? And I would really recommend to those who haven't attended our previous webinar to watch that one as well, because that side that Simon discussed earlier around how do you quantify your risk from third parties is discussed in a little bit more detail in our previous webinar. And we touched upon a certain method, a certain practical method of quantifying risk, which is the Monte Carlo analysis. So yeah, so thank you so much, everyone. I don't see any other questions coming through at the moment. If you do think of any, you can always contact us. Our details are on the slide. Our email addresses are there. You can follow us on LinkedIn as well, and we would be happy to get back to you. And yeah, any other questions that you can think of, send them our way, and I'm sure Simon will be happy to have discussions around third-party risk management, quantitative risk assessments, and anything else. I've also posted a link to the white paper that inspired this webinar series that touches on trends and tips on cyber risk and digital transformation. So I hope you find that useful. And thank you once again, Simon, for running us through all the different aspects of this complex issue of third-party risk management and all the different tips and tricks.
Thank you, Doris.
Yes, I guess that comes to the end of this webinar. Thanks for everyone who joined. We're going to close it off now, but as I said, the recording will be available on both our website and Acuity's website over the coming day, probably most likely tomorrow now. So thank you, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye.